Now we shall move on to our second talk by Professor Bob Fortner. We are greatly honored that Bob offered to fly over all the way from the United States just for this couple of lectures in Hong Kong. Bob is the Professor of Communication and Media at Palm Beach Atlantic University. He had been professors in many universities in the United States, including Northwestern University, Drake University, State University of New York, George Washington University, Calvin College, and Hope University. Last evening, he has already given a talk at Hong Kong U, which was very illuminating and well received. And his topic now is Christianity and Technology, the Uneasy Connection. Professor Bob Fortner now.
Thank you. Since we're a small group, I thought I would sit down. Is that okay?
Yes.
All right. That's terrific. All right. Well, it's really great fun to be here. It is a long flight. It took me 20 hours to get here. But it was well worth it last night, and I hope I can make it worth your time today to have come here as well. Although there is a title for this talk, basically what I want to talk about is redeeming technology, especially communication technology. And to redeem, I mean, just to start at the beginning, to redeem, if you look at the definition, means to compensate for the faults or bad aspects of something. Now we are speaking here of compensation for the faults or the bad aspects of communication technology. Approaching the issue of communications technology from this vantage point also implies that we would know a redeemed technology when we see it. And that at some time in history, a redeemed communication existed. And that this communication, this redeemed communication that existed at some point in history, has been sullied or spoiled by the introduction of technologies to engage in communication. So perhaps the best place to begin is to ask ourselves when this unspoiled communication actually existed. The obvious answer must be in Eden. And I mean Eden before the fall, not after. It was there that God and man walked in the garden together in easy camaraderie. It is when God gave man the cultural task of naming the animals and thus to participate in the creation. And when man knew the one thing forbidden to him. Even after the fall, when God walked in the garden in the cool of the evening, he gave man the opportunity to admit his violation and return to God's protective care. God asked simply, "Adam, where are you?" Now this was not a geographical question, although it may sound that way. I think it was actually a theological question. It was the same question, I think, that Christ put to Peter after his resurrection. Do you love me? Adam, of course, demurred. Peter became frustrated, impatient with Christ, even after his own betrayal. Such, I think, is the human condition. I view communication as the central issue in the connection between the mortal and the immortal. It is through communication that we declare our allegiance to God, that we declare our trespasses and desire for forgiveness, that we spread the word of the gospel, that we pray for relief or intervention, that we worship and sing God's praises. Without communication, we are merely animals. Our communication, as Kenneth Burke said, is action, symbolic action. We are, to reference Ernst Cassirer, animalis symbolicus. What then of communication technology? In examining this question, we can begin in one of two places. We can begin in the garden and ask how technology can return us to that place of bliss, while blaming our plight on the technology itself, that which has continually eroded our relationship with God and one another. In other words, we can just say, well, technology is the problem. Technology caused this splitting of humankind from God. Or we can begin in the aftermath of the garden, when Adam was told that he would work the soil, and although retaining his responsibility for earth and culture, would toil all of his days. Where we begin matters. Are we to blame human technological innovations for removing us further and further from our rightful place beside God, for separating us into individualistic and prideful atomistic creatures who often cannot see the point of connecting flesh to flesh with our fellow humans in a common embrace to respond collectively to human frailty and despair? Or are we to recognize that we spoiled communication long before any communications technology was invented, and that perhaps every new device for connection has also been an effort to correct or ameliorate that original sin of separation and denial? There are, of course, opinions on both sides of the technology question. Some believe that we have finally arrived at the point where global social connections are possible, that Aristotle's claim of human beings as social animals will be manifest in such a way that we will understand, respect, even care for one another as we move toward a paradise on earth. There are others who warn us that we are on the road to perdition, that we are gradually being assimilated into a matrix of lonely people under an illusion of knowing others who actually remain strangers. Perhaps in this dystopian scenario, we have altered who we know as friends or family and been enticed into a corrupt system of narcissism, individually curated branding, and disingenuity. What is the true state of our communications technologies, and how do these technologies interact with or alter the human condition? This is our issue today. Understanding and responding to this issue is not an easy task. Multiple strands of reality must be woven together to create a clear picture of our situation. And I'll attempt to pull these strands together in this talk. First, we begin with human beings living within an existential reality that defined them within small groups, families, clans, tribes, and so on, that wrestled with an often hostile environment by becoming lingual beings who could coordinate responses to everyday life. They recognized the dangers faced, revered those who survived them, the elders, defined themselves collectively in history, tradition, and lore, celebrated the natural world's provision, and sacrificed to it in an effort to influence or control their environment. This was an oral system that included song, dance, poetry, storytelling, and rites of passage as the means to understand and educate new generations. Life could be nasty, brutal, and short, but also celebratory and gratitude-filled. Some of these original humans eventually learned how to write and began to record history, poetry, and story in these societies. This eventually resulted in a process of alienation from existential reality. Those who could write wrote for those who could not, or were separated from the non-writers into enclaves where this new ability could be used to consolidate power, as Harold Innis put it, into both sacred societies ruled by priests who were more concerned to preserve the past and collect the knowledge and wisdom of tradition, and secular societies that sought expansion into empires. These were, Innis wrote, time-biased or space-biased societies. He claimed that the distinction was based on the dominant means of communication employed. Stone or wooden tablets, hard to move around and difficult to edit, gave more power to priests, while papyrus or vellum scrolls, easy both to carry and to edit or replace, gave more power to secular kings. The seal of wax was often required as an indicator of authenticity due to the nature of the perishable medium, something not so required when the medium was virtually permanent. Thus, there developed two different monopolies of knowledge. History was now recorded, not merely lived. History was now the past and not the present. And those who controlled the new intellectual activity of writing were now in a position to consolidate power, claim divinity for themselves, as many of the kings in Europe did, and write the history that would become the final word in this new cultural system. Did this technology have an essence? Did it determine a new destiny for human beings? Although in it we find the seeds of objectivity and individualism, of class systems and division of haves from have-nots, human beings from peasants, serfs, and slaves, I will say no. Nothing was inevitable, determined by technology itself. Some of the divisions that emerged had more cultural purchase than others. For instance, even Paul the Apostle didn't define slavery as an evil, largely because slaves were integrated into households, often had positions of responsibility and respectability, were relied on by their owners. What after all was the difference between an urban slave and a rural peasant? Many might say the slave was better off. When Christ talked of freedom, it was freedom from fleshly appetites, not from political repression. The forces of darkness were demons, not Roman legions. Of course, most people remained far removed from the scribal literate culture enabled by the ability to write. They continued to live in the earlier pre-literate culture of their ancestors, not yet recognizing how chirography was altering the terrain of orthodoxy and political legitimacy. I'm a little behind here. Okay. Martin Heidegger warned against seeing any technology, in this case the quill pen and paper or the stone and chisel, as an enframing. Tools are not themselves an enframing of essence. What this new system of notation, record keeping, inventory control, edict declaration, and lawmaking enframed was the division that manifested in Eden. Man seeking to make his own way, to define his own history, to be in control, to rule over others. This new type of communication was merely a signaler of what Nietzsche called the will to power, an essence of humankind that writing revealed to us. Now, I've spent a goodly amount of time on this early history because this oral chirographic culture and the monopolies of knowledge constructed within it is what I will call our original condition. I know it's not the original condition of the garden, but it is the original condition of human life that has been ejected from the garden and cannot, on its own, return to it. It is the condition that we created for ourselves. The first strand of history, then, is this: human agency. Human desire to define, control, and rule. The exercise of power, one man over another, one tribe over another, one lingual being over another. This takes us to the second strand of reality. This strand begins to find purchase with the spread of printed material in the mid to late 15th century, a time of pushback against those who had claimed authority and power in the oral chirographic period. With the development of the printing press, people began to publish their challenges to the sacro-secular orthodoxies of the previous age. Martin Luther famously became the voice of an anti-Catholic orthodoxy, even while attempting to reform the church. Scientists began to push back against the mythologies that continued their hold on people's assumptions about the physical world. Novelists and diarists began to provide new takes on the human condition. Philosophers began to pull away from the dominant religious assumptions of previous writers to advocate logic and analysis in understanding good and evil, human weakness, and the will to power, to challenge the divine right of kings and the infallibility of religious leadership. Languages began to be codified. Language-based nationalisms developed. The Bible was handed over to the common man in his own language to make sense of it himself, even while this created heartburn for Luther and John Calvin. This was at once a revolution and a development easy to overestimate. It took 400 years from the first printed Bible in 1455 until even half of the population in Europe became literate. So this so-called printing revolution was a single burst and then a long time of mourning. The ability to read, especially about the lives of other people, and to compare it to one's own situation, did concretize and expand the earlier and more tentative move toward an objective view of the world and oneself. People could see themselves in the characters they read about. They could tell their own stories in diaries and journals, which required an objectivity toward themselves that most had not experienced before. The rise of the fact-based report in travelogues and news reports, even when they were laced with fanciful adventures or even fake news, also allowed people to begin to evaluate the significance of events on a basis other than enforced orthodoxies from church or state. God became questionable, as did monarchs and economics and the condition of man as defined by ancient regimes. The exposure to print achieved by the mid-19th century provided large audiences for the condition of the working class in England, the Communist Manifesto, and Das Kapital. A new media system had become dominant, once again based in the will to power and challenges to it, the search for order and control, not only of physical space, but the space of the mind as well. Print and the development of literacy is even thought to be the reason that the idea of childhood slowly emerged. Children were those who could not read, but who increasingly were seen as the target of literacy training, removing them from the workforce and allowing them a period of emotional and intellectual development not stunted by drudgery. What is the point of this strand? That the essence of technology, whatever it is not found in the results of using the technology or of taking the technology apart, but it is in what the technology reveals again and again about what animates its implications. These implications are not in the technology or of the technology, but precede it. The technology is merely a means of seeing what is already present. So, as communications technology, I missed a slide there somewhere. So, as communications technology moved from its oral chirographic manifestation to print, and then electromechanical, and then electronic, and then digital, the desire for control, or power to control, remained. The third strand, all right, where did you come from? Okay. The third strand is the political economic strand. The development of any new technological system must be economically sustained. If the economic basis of it fails, as it did with the video player, the Walkman, the CD, the Windows Phone, then the technology will lose its monopoly status and become a niche system, or disappear. The failure of a technological system may result from replacement by a superior technology, or a more convenient or cheaper one, or it may result from regulatory commitments or political pressure by economic or socio-political entities. Change can be retarded or accelerated by politico-economic realities. These can never be avoided or successfully ignored. They too result from the essence that undergirds changes in technology itself. Capitalism, for instance, with its penchant for creative destruction and innovation, for the means to increase profit, accelerates the use of technology and the will to power, developing one new means after another to a new form of enchantment and a new means to replace the intimacy and collective engagement that have been lost. The fourth strand is alienation. What I mean by this is that each communications technology has taken humankind away from its engagement with the existential world of creation, an oral lingual understanding of that world, an enchanted world, even as each new technology has promised to increase our connection and understanding of the other humans who are themselves seeking to understand their existential condition. James W. Carey referred to such promises as the mythos of technology. What hath God wrought? The first message of the so-called lightning lines of the telegraph. Mr. Watson, come here, I want you. The first message delivered by the telephone. Christmas carols, the first known radio transmission. Television was to enhance the oral experience, it's oral, not oral, oral experience of radio by adding moving images. The computer was to enable data, information, to be collected and disseminated faster than ever possible before. All of these technologies were to conquer time and space, usher in the means to evangelize the world, and hasten the second coming, the ultimate recovery of the existential experience of the creation. Even satellites were heralded by Ben Armstrong when he was president of the National Religious Broadcasters as the arrival of the three angels of Revelation. Since with three placed in exact positions in geosynchronous orbit, a single message could cover the world. The same promise made in an earlier age with the arrival of shortwave radio. One technology would fail, but would beget the next that would surely succeed. Mythos. I refer to this progression as the mythos of instrumentality. Each technology was a new instrument to put to the task of replacing the lost communalism and intimacy of the original human condition. So long as communication technologies were put to use by human beings, we could direct our attention to how to best control them and for what purposes, never recognizing what they revealed about the human condition itself or the increasing legitimation and illusion of power they provided by our interpretation. These technologies also responded, however, to another manifestation of human power, the power to put technology to pecuniary uses. Each technology provided the basis for patent disputes, royalty payments, applications that could provide new means of exploitation by corporate entities, even as they claimed more and more benefits to their client customers. Sometimes regulations were adopted to protect publics. Sometimes not. Sometimes one monopoly was dethroned by another. Sometimes new forms of commercial support supplanted older and more elitist means. Sometimes these technologies found their original support in the form of pornographic image distribution, even while an awestruck public expected access to elitist culture and knowledge. Always, however, regardless of the promises made, the content carried by very... Okay, I'm in the right spot. Where was I? Always, however, regardless of promises made, the content carried by various communications technologies gradually turned from sacred to profane. And usually this was what the public, clamoring for content, eventually accepted. Embraced even, as they turned the technologies to their own uses, seeking intimacy, connection, relief from drudgery, and backdrops for everyday life. Always there were those who could turn the technology into a profit machine by ignoring the more humane applications in favor of the common that would appeal to the lowest common denominator. In 1995, even before the internet as we know it today was developed, David Nicholson lamented that technology had failed to do much for our souls. They were, in my view, failing to provide that connection to existential reality even while continuing to promise to do so. And the Financial Times, in its March 4 issue last month, carried an essay by John Thornhill that began as follows. An increasingly common refrain of our times is to argue that the internet revolution has been betrayed and to agitate for renewed struggle to reclaim the lost utopia. A powerful new technology that promised to liberate knowledge, enrich democracy, and decentralize power has been hijacked by malicious trolls, authoritarian regimes, and rapacious capitalists. In a world grown nostalgic for the future, how can the internet's original promise be reclaimed? It is the age-old question by now. How can we engineer a future for communication through technology that will return us to our long-sought-for past of commonness and community and intimacy? But in Martin Heidegger's terms, the internet, like all those communications technology before it, has truly revealed our fallen nature as human beings seeking power over others, seeking profit and legitimacy, a name for ourselves, a Janus-faced species that fails to recognize its own self-duplicity that the American colloquial expression explains. The right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. We are now on the cusp of a new leap in communications technology, the widespread use of augmented and virtual reality. Reality itself is no longer sufficient. It needs augmentation to the addition of real-time data labeling to, we are told, facilitate our choices, discuss our observations with others using this data, and then reach a deeper understanding or realization of our true situation. Virtual reality likewise promises new means of communication, a space where we can navigate unknown realities outside our own limited view, where we can collaborate in real time with others to solve problems, engage in fantasies, explore new realms, gain new knowledge. Both of these possibilities reveal the same imaginings that have always resulted from our use of technology. The means change while the revealings stay the same. We will not become more cooperative, peaceful, compassionate, merciful, courageous as these new means of communication develop. To think so is to buy into the illusion. We will gain some sense formerly lacking, perhaps. Some users may find aspects of their own character that they had not reveled in before. Some may find that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Timid will remain timid. Reckless as well. None of these technologies will save us from ourselves. How then do we redeem communications technologies? First, we reject fatalism. If you've been listening closely, you may have thought that this is where I was headed. But I'm not a fatalist. I think humanity is capable of change, to act as agents with their eyes open. To do so, however, we have to acknowledge what our true relationship with technology is. It is not one where we use technology as an instrument for control or the pursuit of power. It is not one where we celebrate the possibilities offered by technology to solve some very human problems. We should instead see communications technology as a lens to apprehend the human condition of anomie and alienation resulting from our own application of technology to our communicative desires. The desire itself is admirable. We desire connection. We desire intimacy. We desire the peace and security of Eden that humankind once abandoned. Many of us may not even recognize these desires, as they are only revealed by a close examination of the technologies we have developed and the longing that these developments have opaquely revealed. Peter Paul Verbeek warns against two assumptions when examining the human-technology interface. First, he writes, we should recognize that technology itself, despite the fact that it has no mind or consciousness, no free will, and thus cannot be held responsible for its actions, does have moral significance, as it assists us in shaping our existence and the moral decisions we make. Second, our fear regarding the ongoing fusion of technology and culture that leads us to attempt to protect humanity from technology's alienating powers must not lead us to the conclusion that we are merely cogs in a machine, reduced to the function we have in a technologicalized society. The alienation we have self-engineered through the rapid uptake and use of communications technology should never blind us to the fact of our own complicity in that alienation. The fault is not in the stars or the technologies themselves, but in our assumptions about the value of technology in reversing the alienation we ourselves have engineered. What then might we do? We are clearly not going to return to our so-called idyllic past, technology-free, with all our technology heaped on the fire of disaffection. What we can do, however, is begin to see technologies we love in a new way. Instead of mindlessly buying and using them as their manufacturers and our economic system would have us do, we must become more mindful of their potential convivial roles. I use this term in the sense that Ivan Illich suggested. Illich knew, as he wrote, that, quote, as the power of machines increases, the role of persons more and more decreases to that of mere consumers, unquote. That is a role that we can dispense with through mindful recognition of the reasons technology companies give us for every new or updated product. Every one, however appealing, is an obscured plea for profit and growth. But these self-same technologies can be used, not for the purposes of their makers, but for convivial roles, what Illich calls the opposite of industrial productivity. He intends that this term mean autonomous and creative intercourse among persons and the intercourse of persons with their environment, not the conditioned response to demands made upon us by others. I consider conviviality, he wrote, to be the individual freedom realized in personal interdependence and as such an intrinsic ethical value. That's interdependence, not independence. A convivial society is one characterized by the word enough, not by continual upgrading and replacement of technology. It would be, Illich says, the result of social arrangements that guarantee for each member the most ample and free access to the tools of the community, and would limit this freedom only in favor of another member's equal freedom. What does this mean in practice? Let me make some suggestions very quickly. It means closing the digital divide. One that, for instance, Australia's Bureau of Statistics has said is not going away, and that the U.S.'s Federal Communications Commission has been ignoring, leading the American Civil Liberties Union to suggest that cities should create their own internet service providers to assure that the poor are not left disconnected. It means eschewing the next upgrade to use the funds to assist less financially secure citizens to have their own connected device and to help them learn how to use it for communication purposes. It means assuring connectivity in all schools and the availability of technology in those schools to prevent an increasing gap between have and have-not education. It means taking a stance against surveillance, not to protect one's own identity, but the application of this technology to target others based on ethnicity or status. It means demands that the inbred bias of artificial intelligence against minority citizens be corrected. It means participation in social media, not to score points in political debates or to cyberbully or to criticize, but to use it to build up, legitimize, and add dignity to those largely forgotten in society, and helping them have a voice on these platforms. It even means a willingness to pay for services that are supposedly free, to reduce the incentives for social media platforms to contract with and sell data to entities that would use our information activities as the basis for both commercial and political exploitation. It means demanding social responsibility and accountability from technology companies for their discriminatory and financially driven practices, and being willing to withdraw en masse from using systems that abuse their power by trivializing persons in pursuit of profit. It means pursuing an alternative story of human equality and the need for the pursuit of common equal values for all. And we should be wary of accepting the new promises and possibilities of still further technological development, the so-called new realities that we are to enter through them. They offer exciting possibilities for entertainment, understanding, and knowledge acquisition, but they are not merely benign tools. Ultimately, they remove us further from our lingual past and will, like all the technologies before them, be misidentified as the means to fulfill all needs, when in reality they merely co-opt a profitable, exploitable resource for their own ends. Thanks for your attention.